The elders warned me in the winter of 1980, and this morning I finally understood the truth of their words about the Wendigo, the demon of winter. My name is Arthur Penn, and this is not a story. It is a confession from a quiet room I will likely never leave. For 44 years, I have lived on the edge of the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota, first as a young U.S. park ranger and now as a retiree, in the same small cabin that became my world, my fortress, and my prison. I am telling you this because the silence I have kept has cost me everything, and I need you to understand why. This morning, after more than 4 decades of vigilance, the thing in the woods made its intentions clear. The truth is not just that it's real. The truth is about what it is, where it came from, and the terrible human choice that gave it a name. And I was there when the seed of that choice was planted. I am going to tell you everything. From the beginning, because someone has to. My life back then was measured in tangible things. My credibility is etched into the frost on my window panes and the calluses on my hands from a lifetime of chopping wood. As a ranger, I believed in maps, in compass headings, in the predictable weight of a supply pack. I knew the forest by its sounds, the deafening hush that falls just after a heavy snowfall, a silence so complete it feels like pressure on your eardrum. I knew the specific groan of old pine branches under a burden of ice, a sound like a ship's hull breaking apart in slow motion. The wind that howled through the eaves of my station had a unique signature, a low whistle I could distinguish from any other gale. I wasn't a man given 2 flights of fancy. One dealt with lost hikers, managed controlled burns, and filed reports. My reality was governed by procedure and the hard physics of survival in a place that is indifferent to human life. That pragmatism, that grounding, is why you must believe me. But I was also nursing a deep, private wound of guilt. Just before that winter of 1980, a fellow ranger, my friend Michael, had died. He was caught in a sudden whiteout during a survey, a storm I had misjudged. I was the one who read the weather charts. I was the one who said the window was clear. The official report called it a tragic accident. But in the quiet of my cabin, it was a failure of duty, a failure of friendship. His absence was a cold spot in every room, a silence more profound than any snowfall. This guilt hollowed me out, made me listen when I otherwise would have scoffed. It made me vulnerable to older, stranger truths. I was a cocky young man who suddenly understood that a single mistake, a single misreading of the signs, could erase a life. That lesson, paid for with my friend's life, is what primed me for what came next. It's why, when 2 Ojibwe elders appeared at my door, I didn't turn them away. They came as the first snows began to stick. Their names were Samuel and Peter. They sat with me by the fire, the flames reflecting in their dark, steady eyes. They didn't speak for a long time, just sipped the hot coffee I offered and listened to the wind. There was no preamble. Samuel, the older of the 2, finally broke the silence. "The winter has a voice," he said, his own voice low and rough like stone. "This land is old. It remembers hunger. I was a government man, trained in science and logic. I started to form a polite, dismissive response, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't the look of a man telling a ghost story. It was the look of a man giving a safety briefing. He told me that when the hunger becomes great, the forest will try to trick you. It will use what you love and what you've lost against you. He then gave me the first rule, a command spoken with absolute gravity. You must never, ever answer when it calls with the voice of someone you know." Peter spoke next, his gaze fixed on the fire, as if reading something in the coals. He told me the hunger wasn't just a feeling, it was a power, an emptiness that seeks to be filled. He said that in the deepest parts of winter, when the world is frozen and provisions run low, the land itself can offer a terrible bargain. It can present a feast where there is only starvation, a quick solution born of desperation. His warning was more cryptic, more chilling, and it burrowed into my mind in a way I couldn't shake. "You must never eat what the ice offers you," he whispered, the words barely disturbing the air. I asked him what he meant. A frozen animal, a strange plant. He just shook his head slowly, a deep sadness in his expression. "It is not about finding food," he said. "It is about what you are willing to become when there is none. The ambiguity of it was a hook that would stay in me for years. A question I was terrified to answer. When they left, the cabin felt colder, the silence outside more menacing. I was alone with their 2 warnings, 2 impossible rules dropped into my logical, orderly world. Part of me, the pragmatic ranger, wanted to dismiss it as local superstition, a folktale to explain the harshness of the Minnesota winter. But the other part of me, the man raw with guilt over Michael's death, couldn't let it go. I had misjudged the signs once, with fatal consequences. What if these were just signs of a different kind? So I made a decision. It wasn't a pact with a spirit or a demon. It was a pact with the warning itself. I would treat their words not as folklore, but as a procedure, a new protocol for survival. My ritual would be one of avoidance. My discipline would be born from fear. I would keep my pantry overstocked. I would never stray from marked trails after the first snow. And I would listen to the forest, not with a ranger's ear for falling trees, but for the sound of a voice I recognized. It didn't take long for the test to come. It was later that same winter, during a blizzard that buried my cabin up to the windowsills. The world outside was a churning chaos of white. The wind, a physical force, shaking the log walls. Then, as the storm reached its peak, I heard it. A sound that should have been impossible. It was faint at first, a thin thread of noise woven through the howl of the wind. A cry for help. I moved to the window, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I strained to listen, telling myself it was a branch, an animal, the wind playing tricks. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, and a cold dread washed over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I knew that voice. It was the exact timbre, the cadence, the precise way he would shout my name across a clearing. It was Michael. My dead friend was calling for me from the heart of the storm. The horror wasn't just the voice, it was where it came from. It drifted from the northeast, from a sector of the forest known as the Witch's Kettle Tangle of jagged ravines and disorienting rock formations. It was a place that old-timers avoided, and it was the last place Michael and I had discussed surveying. He had been the one to warn me against it, telling me the maps were unreliable and that compasses behaved strangely there. He had said, "Art, if you ever get in trouble out here, don't go that way. That place will swallow you." And now, his own voice was calling me into the very trap he had warned me about. It was a perfect, cruel inversion. The voice of my guilt, the ghost of my failure, was calling me to my doom from the one place he told me never to go. The intelligence of it, the sheer predatory cunning, was paralyzing. It knew my history. It knew my pain. It was using my own heart as bait. My training, my duty, my guilt, every fiber of my being screamed at me to put on my gear and go. To be the hero I had failed to be for Michael. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe it was a trick of the wind and my own grieving mind. To not go felt like a betrayal all over again. But the elder's warning was a physical presence in the room. A cold hand on my shoulder. Asterisk, never answer when it calls with the voice of someone you know. Asterisk, I stood there, frozen, halfway between the door and the fire. The voice calling my name, Art. Arthur, help me. It sounded so desperate, so real. The battle inside me was immense. It was the ultimate test, my guilt versus my survival, my past versus their warning. With a sob of fear and resignation, I made my choice. I turned away from the door. I walked to the fireplace, my legs trembling, and I slid the heavy iron bolt across the door. The metallic clang was the loudest sound in the world. I spent the rest of that night feeding the fire, making it raw, trying to burn away the sound of Michael's voice. Every gust of wind carried his pleas, his accusations. I sat there, a ranger sworn to protect, hiding from a ghost. The voice eventually grew fainter, finally swallowed by the storm as dawn approached. The silence that followed was worse than the calling. It was a heavy, knowing silence. The silence of something that has tested you and found you compliant. That morning I looked out at the pristine, unmarked snow, and I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that I was not alone in that forest. Second, that I had made the right choice. My silence began that day. A secret kept from my superiors, from my family, from everyone. A 44-year silence that I am only breaking now. Because what I learned this morning proves that the avoidance was never going to be enough. This is where my story truly begins. The story of how I lived alongside a thinking, strategic predator for over 4 decades, learning its rules, its boundaries, and its horrific purpose. I've kept this to myself to protect others, and to protect myself. But the outside world has finally pushed its way in, and the rules have changed. The hunger is back. If you've felt that shiver up your spine when you're alone in the woods, or heard a sound you couldn't explain on a winter night, then you know a small piece of this feeling. Stick with me. If you find this confession compelling, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone you think needs to hear it. What I have to tell you is not easy, but you need to hear it to the end to understand the warning. That first spring, after the snow melted, I walked to the witch's kettle. I didn't go in, I just stood at the edge. The place felt wrong. The air was colder there, the silence heavier. There were no bird calls. I found the remains of a deer, but not in any way I recognized. The ribs had been snapped outward. The bones scoured clean, almost polished. The skull was cracked open, empty. It wasn't the work of wolves or a bear. It was the work of a terrible, efficient hunger. It was a message, a confirmation of what I had heard in the storm. Standing there, I understood that hiding behind a bolted door was a temporary solution. The thing was intelligent. It had tested me with Michael's voice. What would it use next time? I couldn't spend every winter cowering by the fire, waiting. I had to establish a border, a treaty. The silence I had kept was a passive act. I needed an active one. I needed to show that I understood, that I would respect its territory if it respected mine. This was no longer just about my guilt. It was about survival. My mind went back to Samuel and Peter, to the quiet dignity with which they spoke their warning. It wasn't a spooky campfire story. It was an instruction manual for coexistence. They weren't trying to scare the young ranger. They were trying to keep him alive. I remembered the small leather pouch Samuel carried, the scent of tobacco that clung to his clothes. It was a scent of offering, of respect. I realized their warning wasn't just a prohibition. It contained the seed of the solution. You don't fight the ancient powers of a place like this. You don't challenge them. You acknowledge them. You draw a line not of defiance, but of mutual understanding. The creature was a manifestation of hunger, of the desperation winter brings. So, I would not offer it food. That would be an invitation, a dangerous misunderstanding of its nature. I would offer it respect, acknowledgement, a symbolic gesture that I knew it was there and that I intended to stay on my side of the line. The following November, just as the air grew that familiar, brittle edge, presaging the first deep snow, I took a new pouch of good pipe tobacco and walked out from my cabin. I had already chosen the spot, about 200 yards northeast. Right at the edge of the sightline, to the witch's kettle, stood a gnarled, ancient oak. It was older than any other tree in the vicinity, its branches twisted like arthritic fingers against the grey sky. It felt like a sentinel, a natural boundary marker that had stood for centuries. This would be the place. This would be the line. My heart was a cold lump in my chest. Part of me, the government man, the pragmatist, felt like a fool performing some pagan ritual. But the part of me that had heard Michael's voice in the blizzard knew this was the most rational thing I had ever done. It was a calculated risk, an attempt to impose a single, understandable rule on an unknowable entity. I was speaking the only language I thought it might understand, the language of territory. The crunch of my boots on the frosted ground sounded deafeningly loud. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me freeze, listening. The forest was watching. I could feel it, a pressure in the air, a stillness that was not peaceful but predatory. I reached the oak, its bark rough and cold under my gloved fingers. I didn't say a word. There were no prayers, no incantations. I simply untied the leather string of the pouch and wedged it securely in a fissure of the bark where the main trunk split in two. It was a simple, quiet act. I was leaving a sign that said, "I know you're here. This is my space, that is yours. I will not cross into it." I backed away slowly, never turning my back on the woods, my eyes scanning the dense wall of pine and shadow. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical touch. I made it back to my cabin, locked the door, and didn't look outside again until morning. The first rule of our pact was offered. The next morning I looked out, half expecting the tobacco to be gone. It was still there. For a moment, my pragmatic mind felt a rush of disappointment, of foolishness. But then I noticed something else. The snow that had fallen overnight was a fine light dusting, a perfect canvas. And there, circling the cabin, in a wide, almost perfect circumference, was a single line of tracks. They were impossibly long, narrow footprints. The stride between them almost twice what a man could make, even running. The line of tracks went all the way around my property, but at no point did they come closer than the old oak tree. They respected the boundary I had proposed. The tobacco pouch was the offer. The line of footprints was the signature on the treaty. The pact was sealed. It understood. My fear didn't vanish. It changed. It was no longer the terror of the unknown, but the quiet, constant tension of the warden. And so the ritual began, the engine of my new life. Every year, without fail, in the days before the first true snowstorm, I make the same walk, the same pouch of tobacco, the same ancient oak. It's not a habit. It's a protocol as vital as stocking firewood. It is a renewal of the terms, a reminder. The woods have a memory, and I have learned not to let it forget our arrangement. Sometimes, after I leave the offering, I hear a sound from deep in the forest, a sharp crack, like a massive tree branch snapping under impossible weight. It is not threatening. It is a reply, an acknowledgement, receipt confirmed. This yearly act became the anchor of my sanity, a small point of control in a world governed by a power I could never hope to understand. It was a simple exchange. I offered a token of respect, and it offered me a perimeter, a fragile circle of safety in a vast, hungry wilderness. Greed has a scent, and I was showing I had none. In return for my discipline, the creature began to teach me, not intentionally, but through its habits. I learned to read the forest in a new way. I was no longer just a ranger. I became an interpreter of its grim signs. I would find the deer carcasses, always in the same condition, with the bones picked clean and the marrow sucked dry. But their locations told a story. They were a map of its hunting grounds, its patrol routes. I knew, with more accuracy than any DNR survey, which parts of the forest were active, which ravines to avoid, which ridges were its domain that season. This knowledge was a terrible burden, but it was also a form of protection. It was the other side of our pact. I kept it secret, and its actions, in their own terrifying way, helped keep me alive. The rules were written in snow, and I was learning to read them. I was becoming an unwilling expert on the apex predator nobody else knew existed. My pantry, once stocked for convenience, became a fortress. The elder's second warning, never eat what the ice offers you, echoed in my mind. I began to understand it wasn't just about cannibalism in the classic sense. It was about desperation. It was about the moment when any choice seems better than starving. By keeping my cabin perpetually overstocked, with enough canned goods and dried meat to last to winters, I was removing that choice from my own future. I was ensuring that I would never be desperate enough to be tempted by a strange offering, or by the unthinkable. My ritual wasn't just the tobacco at the oak tree. It was the discipline of absolute preparedness. It was a constant, vigilant rejection of the hunger it represented. My cabin was an island of abundance in an ocean of scarcity. A bulwark against the temptation that I now understood was the creature's very nature. The evidence of its intelligence, its strategic mind, continued to mount in small, terrifying ways. During one particularly harsh winter, I saw a set of its long, narrow tracks leading towards a frozen lake. But they stopped at the edge. A few days later, I found a wolf that had not been so cautious. It had clearly chased a deer onto the ice. The ice was fractured in a perfect, unnatural circle, and the wolf was gone, sunk. But the deer tracks led safely away on the other side. The creature hadn't just hunted, it had set a trap. It had herded the deer across a specific, stable path, and waited for its own predator, the wolf, to follow onto a weaker section. It was a level of tactical thinking that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just a monster. It was a general. It understood physics, patience, and the habits of other hunters. This pact dictated the shape of my life. My career as a ranger wound down. but I couldn't leave. How could I sell this cabin to some unsuspecting family? How could I abandon my post? So I retired right here. My isolation became absolute. Friends stopped trying to visit. Their invitations met with my increasingly flimsy excuses. I couldn't risk a visitor showing up in late November and asking what I was doing out by that old oak. I couldn't risk someone staying the night and hearing a sound in the wind that sounded a little too much like a human voice. The secret was a wall between me and the rest of the world. I became the strange old man in the last cabin on the forest road, a local curiosity. They had no idea that my strangeness was a shield, protecting them from a truth their minds couldn't handle. The cost of the secret was my own humanity. And the creature seemed to understand. It patrolled its border, and I patrolled mine. The silence between us was a language. The absence of its presence near my cabin was as loud as any spoken word. For years, this grim equilibrium held. I would watch the seasons turn, feel the familiar dread rise with the autumn chill, perform my ritual, and settle in for another winter of listening. Listening to the groan of the pines, the howl of the wind, and the utter complete silence where the creature's footsteps never fell. It was a lonely existence, but it was a stable one. A life built around a single, terrifying truth. It was a fragile peace, and I knew, deep down, that it was the kind of peace that the outside world, with its noise and its greed, was bound to shatter. A quiet place is a vacuum, and the modern world abhors a vacuum. The first real test of our treaty came not from the creature, but from my own species. In the late 80s, a family in a big station wagon, hopelessly unprepared, got their car stuck in a snowdrift on the road a mile from my cabin. It was a bad storm, coming on fast. I heard their shouts, the father's voice, thin and panicked in the wind. But then, I heard something else, an echo. A perfect mimicry of the father's voice, but it was coming from deeper in the woods. Away from the road, Timmy, over here, I found a path. It called a cruel and perfect ventriloquism. The boy, no older than 10, started to wander off the road, toward the voice. The creature was using their panic to separate them, to hunt. It was an active, strategic violation, drawn out by the scent of easy prey. It wasn't breaking our pact. It was simply hunting in the space between our territories. I couldn't let it happen, but I couldn't reveal myself. I couldn't reveal, it. I grabbed my old service revolver, ran to the back of my cabin, and fired 2 shots straight up into the air. The crack of the gunshots shattered the evening quiet, a sound of human authority. On the road, the family froze. The boy stopped. The mimicked voice in the woods fell silent instantly. The creature knew that sound. It knew what it meant. It was a challenge I had never issued before, an intrusion. I then used the diversion, circling around and approaching the family from the direction of the road, pretending I had just come to investigate the noise. I was just a helpful ranger, coming to the rescue. I never told them what was really calling to their son. I just said, "The cold plays tricks on your ears out here. Let's get you warm." That night, after I had led them to safety and sent them on their way, the feeling around my cabin was different. The air was thick with a resentful, angry energy. The tracks I found the next morning were not the usual patrol. They were deep, gouged into the snow, circling closer to the cabin than ever before, though still not crossing the invisible line of the oak. It had been close, a near disaster. I had broken my silent neutrality. I had intervened, and the creature knew it. I had protected the human world, and in doing so, I had strained the fragile peace of my own. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat by the fire, listening, and understood a new rule. The pact was not a shield for the whole world. It was a pact for me alone, and defending others would come at a price I was not sure I could afford to pay again. The years that followed my intervention with that family settled into a grim rhythm. Our pact held, but the foundation of it had been shaken. The creature's anger was a palpable thing in the forest, a brooding silence that lasted for months. The winter tracks it left were deeper, more aggressive, a constant reminder that I had overstepped. But it did not cross the line of the old oak. It seemed to understand that my action was not an act of aggression against it, but a defense of my own kind. It was a complex and dangerous negotiation conducted in footprints and silence. The rules were being clarified. I was the warden of my small island of humanity, and it was the undisputed sovereign of everything else. It was a truce, not a friendship, and the tension of it was a constant weight in the air. The forest was no longer a place of simple solitude. It was a contested borderland, and I was the lone sentry on the wall. Then something shifted. A few winters later, I found a strange arrangement near my path. 3 branches, thick as my arm, had been snapped and laid in a precise triangular pattern, pointing west. I had never seen anything like it. It was deliberate, a signal. My ranger training told me the weather was clear, the barometric pressure stable, but the symbol felt like a warning from a more ancient source. I trusted it. I cancelled my plan to check trap lines on the far ridge, and instead spent the day reinforcing the seals on my windows and stacking extra wood by the door. That night, a blizzard of unprecedented fury descended from the west, a clipper storm that the weather service had completely missed. It would have caught me out in the open, miles from home. The creature hadn't saved me out of kindness. It had simply informed me. It needed me here, alive, maintaining the pact. It was the first time it had communicated something to me that wasn't a threat. The bond, if you can call it that, deepened one January when a nasty flu laid me low. I was bedridden for 4 days, weak, feverish, and vulnerable. In my delirium, I feared it would sense my weakness, that it would see this as an opportunity, that the pact would be voided by my inability to patrol my own border. I expected to hear it, to sense it circling closer. Instead, there was nothing. The forest outside my window fell utterly, unnaturally silent. No squirrels chattering, no jays scolding, not even the sound of the wind in the pines. It was a vacuum. When I was finally strong enough to look outside, I saw why. A wide, barren circle of snow surrounded my cabin, devoid of any animal tracks at all, except for a single ominous set of its long footprints that patrolled the perimeter far out, 100 yards away. It wasn't protecting me. It was guarding its territory, and I and my cabin were now a permanent fixture within it. It kept other predators away, not for my sake, but to preserve the strange, static ecosystem we had created. This fragile peace was shattered not by a sound, but by an ambition. The sound of engines, of men shouting, of chainsaws biting into young trees near the county road. A developer from Duluth had bought a large tract of land bordering the national forest, my buffer zone. Their plan was to build 24 luxury cabins, a resort for wealthy city folk looking for a taste of the wild. They came with an army's worth of equipment and an industrial-grade arrogance. They saw the woods as empty space, a resource to be carved up and sold. They couldn't feel the ancient stillness they were violating. They couldn't smell the thing their noise and their greed was beginning to stir from its slumber. I watched them from the ridge above, my heart cold with dread. They were ringing a dinner bell, and they had no idea what kind of hunger would answer. For weeks, I observed their progress. They were a swarm of bright orange vests and buzzing machinery. They used laser surveying tools that sent beams of red light lancing through the ancient pines. And they flew drones that whined like mechanical hornets, mapping every contour of the land. They were trying to quantify it, to shrink it down to data points and property lines. I could feel the creature's presence in the woods beyond them, a gathering storm of stillness. It was watching them, too. The air grew heavy, the way it does before a lightning strike. The developers were trespassing on a scale I never could have imagined. They weren't just crossing a line in the snow. They were trying to erase the entire map, to replace the old language of the forest with their own language of profit and concrete foundations. Their hubris was breathtaking, and I knew it would be punished. The forest began to push back. At first, it was small things. Their high-tech GPS units would inexplicably lose their satellite lock. Despite clear skies, expensive surveying drones would return with corrupted memory cards. The video footage, a blizzard of digital static. The audio files filled with what the foreman called weird audio artifacts, faint rhythmic clicking sounds and what sounded almost like a whisper just beneath the noise of the rotors. They blamed solar flares, magnetic deposits in the rock. They were men of science, and they had a rational explanation for everything. They couldn't comprehend that they were being warned, that the forest itself was scrambling their attempts to read it, that the entity within it was a ghost in their machine, speaking in a language of technological failure. They were being told to leave, but they weren't listening. The final message was delivered with chilling efficiency. One evening, the crew locked their most valuable electronics, the laser theodolite, the drone controls, laptops inside a reinforced steel trailer, secured with a heavy-duty padlock. The foreman joked that not even a bear with a blowtorch could get in. The next morning, the crew arrived to find the trailer exactly as they'd left it. The padlock was untouched, still locked. But when they opened the doors, the trailer was empty. Every single piece of equipment was gone. There were no tracks in the soft earth around the trailer. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of any kind. It was simply gone, as if it had evaporated. The loss was in the tens of thousands of dollars. 2 days later, the entire operation was shut down. The developers cut their losses, scared off not by a monster, but by a perfect, inexplicable, and financially ruinous mystery. The silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. Years passed. The grim quiet held. I grew older. My hair turned the color of the winter snow. But the world's hunger for wilderness had changed. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about stories. The next invasion didn't come from a bulldozer, but from a car radio. I was listening to the public station one afternoon when I heard a familiar name, Superior National Forest. It was a trailer for a podcast, a true crime show. The host's voice was slick, theatrical. His name was Julian Croft, and his new season was dedicated to reinvestigating the cold case of the Anderson family, who had vanished without a trace back in 1993, not 5 miles from my cabin. He spoke of the eerie legends of the area, of a spirit of eternal hunger. He was turning the elders' sacred warning into a marketing hook. He was selling my reality as entertainment. Croft's podcast was a hit, and it brought a new kind of pestilence. Not developers, but consumers of darkness. Thrill seekers and amateur ghost hunters started driving down my remote road, a road that had been mine alone for decades. They parked their cars and took selfies with the menacing tree line in the background. They left trash. They were loud, disrespectful, and utterly oblivious. They were tourists in my private nightmare. They came looking for a ghost story, not understanding that they were walking into a hunting ground. Their casual, noisy presence was a constant provocation. Each car that drove by, each flash of a camera, felt like a stone thrown at a sleeping bear. I felt the pact straining, the creature's patience wearing thin. This was a hunger for content, for clicks, for notoriety, a modern greed, and it had a scent all its own. The podcaster himself was the worst of it. He positioned himself as a brave truth-teller, a modern knight fighting the darkness. But he was just a merchant. He spoke of the Wendigo with a scholar's detached curiosity, stripping it of its power, reducing it to a piece of compelling lore. He was getting closer to the truth than the developers ever had, but for all the wrong reasons. He interviewed locals, dug up old case files, and speculated wildly, all while encouraging his listeners to visit the haunted forest. He was actively drawing people toward the danger, not away from it. This felt like a more profound violation than the developers' bulldozers. They had only wanted the land. Julian Croft wanted its soul. He was commodifying the terror, and in doing so, he was making the creature's existence a public matter. The inevitable finally happened. One of Croft's most ardent followers, a college kid named Ben, decided he would be the one to solve the mystery. Armed with a smartphone and a head full of romantic notions about ghost hunting, he announced on a fan forum that he was going into the witch's kettle to livestream his investigation. He wanted to be a hero for his podcasting idol. He went off the established trail, broadcasting his every step to an online audience. I watched his progress on my own laptop, my internet connection slow and unreliable, my dread growing with every minute. He was a lamb walking into the slaughterhouse, and he was taking thousands of people with him. Then, through my laptop speakers, I heard it begin. A new voice, joining the sound of the wind in the boy's microphone. It was a perfect mimicry, not of a lost loved one, but of the very man the boy idolized. Ben, is that you?" Over here, it was Julian Croft's slick, confident voice, calling from deeper in the ravine. "I think I found something. It looks like the locket from the old case files." It was the most brilliant, diabolical lure I had ever witnessed. The creature was using the boy's own ambition, his desire for discovery, and the approval of his hero, as the bait. I could hear the excitement in Ben's voice on the stream. "Guys, did you hear that? I think that's him. Julian must be out here too. I'm going." He was stumbling through the undergrowth, toward the voice, toward the trap, and he was broadcasting his own doom to the world. My mind raced. This was the station wagon all over again, but worse. This time, the leer was tailored with surgical precision. A simple diversion, a gunshot in the air, might not be enough. It might even add to the show for the audience online. I had to break the spell. I had to terrify the boy so completely that his only instinct would be to run, not towards the voice, but away from it, back to the safety of the road. My pact with the creature was about mutual avoidance. But my duty as a human being, the old ranger instinct I thought I had buried, screamed at me to act. I made a choice. I grabbed my hunting rifle from the rack above the door. I was about to break the most important rule. I was going to interfere directly, and this time the consequences would be unavoidable. I ran out onto my porch, the cold air stinging my lungs. I could hear the faint sound of the boys shouting, carried on the wind. I didn't aim at the sound of the mimicked voice. I aimed at the boy, not at him, but near him. High, into the trees, just above his position. I needed the sound, the violent crack of the bullet, to be personal. An attack, not a random noise. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a physical blow, a deafening roar that ripped through the forest's tense quiet. A moment later, I heard it through my open door, from the laptop still streaming inside. Ben's scream. Pure animal terror. The sound of him crashing through the brush, sobbing, running for his life. The mimicked voice fell silent. I had saved him, but that gunshot was a confession broadcast to the world. It was a flare, shot from a place that was supposed to be empty. My anonymity, the very foundation of my 40-year vigil, was the price. The secret was out, and I knew, with chilling certainty, who would be coming to investigate. The days that followed the gunshot were the longest of my life. The forest's silence, once a comfort, became an accusation. Every creak of my cabin's logs, every gust of wind, sounded like the prelude to discovery. I had torn a hole in the quiet world I had so carefully constructed. I sat by the window, watching the empty road, my hunting rifle cleaned and propped by the door. Not for the creature I knew its response would be more subtle, but for the cars I expected to see. A sheriff's deputy, a park ranger, maybe even Julian Croft himself, drawn by the dramatic conclusion to his followers' live stream. I had traded my carefully guarded secret for a boy's life, and now I waited for the world to come and collect the debt. The pact I had with the creature felt broken, or at least renegotiated without my consent. My intervention was a declaration, and I was terrified of the reply, not from the woods, but from the civilization I had long ago abandoned. My anxiety was a constant metallic taste in my mouth. I had spent 44 years becoming a ghost, a local footnote, a man who existed only on the very periphery of the world. That single rifle shot had made me solid again. It put me on a map. I found myself obsessively replaying the sound, the way it had echoed through the ravines, a brutal and undeniable piece of evidence. It was the sound of my failure to remain invisible. Sleep offered little escape. I would jolt awake at the sound of a truck gearing down on the distant highway, my heart pounding, convinced it was turning onto my road. My fortress had become a fishbowl. The isolation I had once curated as a shield now felt like a trap, amplifying every imagined sound, turning the familiar groans of my home into the footsteps of approaching judgment. I had protected a stranger, and in doing so, I had exposed myself to the very world I'd been hiding from. The third night after the shot, exhaustion finally took me completely, and I dreamt. I dreamt of Eleanor, my wife, who passed from cancer more than a decade ago. It wasn't a sad dream. It was a simple, vivid memory. We were young, sitting on this very porch, on a bright, clear autumn day. She was pointing out the different birds at the feeder, her voice full of a light I had almost forgotten. She was laughing, her head tilted back, the sun catching the silver threads in her hair. The dream was so real, I could smell the wood smoke from the chimney and the faint sweet scent of her perfume. There was no monster in the dream. There was no pact, no guilt. Number 40-year vigil. There was only peace. A forgotten warmth that spread through my chest. A powerful reminder of a life before the silence. It was a deep and profound comfort. And for those few hours, I was not the warden of a terrible secret. I was just a man remembering love. I woke slowly, the feeling of peace from the dream still clinging to me like a warm blanket. But something was wrong. The air in the cabin was sharp, cold. I sat up and saw it. The small window above my bedside table, the one I always bolted shut from October to May, was cracked open just an inch. A sliver of frigid morning air was streaming in, and there, on the dark, weathered wood of the windowsill, lay a single, perfect, snowy owl feather. It was impossibly white, its edges soft and flawless, glowing in the pale pre-dawn light. My heart stopped. My first thought was the dream. Eleanor. It was a sign. My logical mind immediately tried to fight it. A draft must have blown the window open. A bird must have flown by, but it was no use. The feather was placed too perfectly, too deliberately. It lay exactly in the center of the sill, like an offering, a single, silent, impossible object. Eleanor had loved snowy owls. She called them the ghosts of the winter. She had a small collection of feathers she'd found over the years, jay, cardinal, flickerbutt. She had never found one from a snowy owl. It had been a small, gentle quest of hers, something we would look for on our walks. To see one now, in this place, at this time, felt like a message sent across a chasm I didn't believe could be crossed. For a long, breathless moment, the raw grief I had buried for a decade rose up in me. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers hovering just above the feather. I thought of her laughter in the dream. A tear I didn't know was coming rolled down my cheek and fell onto the wooden floor. It was a moment of pure, heartbreaking magic. A visitation, a whisper from a ghost I actually wanted to hear from. A gift. And then, a colder, more terrifying realization began to dawn. The bolt on that window was heavy, stiff. No draft could have moved it. Someone, or something, had to have unlatched it from the outside, opened it, and placed that feather there. The warmth in my chest turned to ice. This wasn't a gift from Eleanor. It was a message from the creature. The thought was so violating, so deeply intrusive, that it almost buckled my knees. It had been outside my window while I slept. It had been close enough to touch my home. But it hadn't been an act of aggression. It was a gesture of, what? Understanding. It had seen my act of protection, my defense of the boy, one of my own kind. And this was its response. It was showing me that it, too, could understand things beyond hunger. It could understand grief, memory, symbolism. It saw into me. It had watched me for years, learned me, and now it was using my own love, my own loss, as a form of communication. This single feather changed everything. The creature was no longer just an intelligent predator, a strategic hunter. It was a consciousness. It possessed a capacity for something that felt unnervingly close to empathy, or at least a terrifyingly accurate mimicry of it. It wasn't just a monster born of hunger. It was a memory. The act of placing that feather was one of such profound and intimate knowledge that it shattered my perception of the pact. Our agreement wasn't just a territorial treaty between a man and a beast. It was a relationship, a grim coexistence with an entity that observed, learned, and remembered. It saw my act of saving the boy, not as an attack on it, but as an act of grief. A desperate attempt to prevent another loss, like the loss of Michael, like the loss of Eleanor. It saw the wound inside me, and it had just laid a feather directly upon it. I was no longer its warden. I was its subject. The feather and the podcast began to merge in my mind. Julian Croft's theatrical voice talking about the 1993 Anderson disappearance. A family father, mother, 2 children, vanished in an early blizzard, not 5 miles from here. Their station wagon was found weeks later, stuck in a drift, completely empty of supplies. I pulled out my old ranger maps and my own private journals from that year. I remembered that storm. It came fast and hard. A monster of a blizzard that buried the forest in 4 feet of snow in less than 12 hours. The Andersons wouldn't have stood a chance if they were caught on foot. They were from the city, unprepared. Their disappearance was officially ruled as death by exposure. Their bodies never recovered. But now, looking at the feather on my sill, a new, terrible thought began to form. A question that made the hair on my arms stand up. I thought of the Elder's second warning, the one that had haunted me for over 40 years. You must never eat what the ice offers you. I had always assumed it was a warning against some form of spiritual corruption, or perhaps finding an animal frozen in the ice and being tempted to eat it. But what if the offering wasn't an animal? What if you were trapped in a blizzard, starving, and the ice, the cold, the desperation offered you each other? What if the unspeakable choice was the only choice left? Peter's sad face floated in my memory. It is not about finding food, he had said. It is about what you are willing to become when there is none. I stared at the map, at the location where the Andersons' car was found. It was deep inside the creature's territory. The hunger, the desperation, the choice. A story of a lost family was slowly, horrifyingly, becoming an origin story. Then the final piece clicked into place. So sharp and so horrible, it felt like a physical blow. The feather. Why a snowy owl feather? The creature was communicating with me, using my grief for Eleanor. But what if that wasn't the symbol's primary meaning? I remembered the news reports after the Andersons vanished. There was an interview with the daughter's elementary school teacher. She was crying, talking about what a sweet, quiet girl Sarah Anderson was. And she mentioned something specific, a detail to humanize the loss for the TV audience. She said, Sarah was a little nature collector. She loved birds. Her prized possession, the teacher said, was a single, perfect snowy owl feather she had found and kept in a little box. The blood drained from my face. The feather on my windowsill wasn't for me. It wasn't about my wife. It was a memory. The creature's memory of a daughter it had lost. I was no longer just the keeper of a secret. I was the lone witness to Atreides' horrifying afterlife. The creature in the woods, the entity I called the Wendigo, was not a demon. It was a father. The Anderson father. Transformed by an unspeakable act of survival, forever haunting the place of his sin. Forever grieving. This act, this feather, wasn't a threat. It was a plea. A confession from one grieving father to a grieving husband. It saw me save that boy, and in that act, it saw a reflection of a choice it failed to make. The mystery wasn't just about a monster anymore. It was about a man. My role had changed. I had to do more than just maintain the pact. I had to understand what happened, and I had to protect this terrible, tragic truth from the hungry, prying eyes of the world. My vigil has changed. It's no longer about fear. It's about a terrible, profound pity. The entity in the woods is no less dangerous, but now it has a face. A history. My story is far from over, because this revelation has put me on a collision course with the modern world. If you're starting to understand the weight of this, the human tragedy behind the myth, then please show your support by leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Share this confession. The authorities are coming, and the podcaster is still circling. You need to stay until the end to hear how this fragile, terrifying understanding I've reached is about to be shattered. The real battle for this forest is about to begin. The knock came 2 days later. It wasn't the tentative rap of a lost hiker. It was firm, measured, and official. 3 knocks, then silence. Through the thick glass of the window, I saw the dark green uniform of the Department of Natural Resources. Her name was Officer Cole, and she stood on my porch as if she owned it. She was younger than I expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a jawline that suggested a complete intolerance for nonsense. She said she was here about the unauthorized discharge of a firearm near a public trail. The lost college kid, Ben, had given a frantic statement about being shot at. Her voice was calm, professional, but her eyes were conducting their own search, cataloging the state of my porch, the woodpile, the look of the man who opened the door. Her presence was an immediate violation. the first note in a symphony of intrusion that I knew was about to begin. The authority I had avoided for a lifetime was standing 3 feet away, and it had my name. Her questions began as a formality, a checklist on a clipboard. She asked about the incident with the boy, and I gave her a practiced, folksy story about scaring off a large wolf that was getting too close to the trail. I played the part of the slightly eccentric but harmless old-timer, but her focus quickly shifted. She wanted to know how long I'd lived here, about my time as a ranger, about the changes I'd seen in the woods over the years. Her questions were like a surgeon's probe, searching for a weak spot. "It's a quiet place," she stated, her gaze fixed on me. "But things go missing out here. People, equipment. You must have heard the stories." I felt a cold, not tighten in my stomach. She wasn't just investigating a gunshot. She was investigating a pattern, and she clearly believed I was the center of it. My carefully constructed solitude was being dismantled, question by question, by a woman who saw the forest not as a mystery, but as a crime scene waiting to be processed. Her visit wasn't just an interrogation. It was a declaration. She told me that due to the recent incident and a review of historical cases, she mentioned the missing developers. Equipment, specifically, the DNR, was initiating a comprehensive environmental survey of the sector. The phrase was a lie, and we both knew it. It was a blank check for a full-scale invasion. She spoke of establishing a temporary command post on the old logging road, of bringing in teams to conduct a grid search. She said they needed to fully assess the ecological stability and predatory animal populations in the area. What she meant was that she was going to turn my world, my sanctuary, and the creature's territory upside down. She was going to drag the modern world, with all its noise and light and disbelief, into the one place it was never meant to be. The fragile peace I had bought with 44 years of silence was about to be voided by bureaucratic order. The methods she described were a technological nightmare. She spoke of deploying a network of seismic sensors to detect ground movement, of game cameras with thermal imaging capabilities placed every 100 meters, of aerial drones flying pre-programmed routes, day and night. Her voice was full of a cold, professional pride as she detailed how this grid would leave no corner unobserved. I pictured it, the constant, high-pitched whine of the drones replacing the sound of the wind, the invisible, heat-seeking eyes of the cameras, turning the ancient, breathing darkness into a 24-hour video feed. The sensors buried in the earth, feeling every footstep. It was a plan born of a profound arrogance, an assumption that anything could be understood if you just threw enough data at it. This wasn't a survey, it was a desecration. It was a violation that the creature, the grieving father, would undoubtedly perceive as a direct, aggressive, and intolerable attack. After she left, the paranoia I'd been holding at bay flooded in. My cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a cage. I found myself obsessively checking the locks, peering out the windows at every shadow. Was she watching me right now? The next afternoon, I heard a faint high-frequency whine from high above the tree canopy. A drone. It was a sound so alien in this place that it felt like a physical pain. They were already mapping their battlefield. I walked the perimeter of my property and found a small, fresh blaze of orange paint on a tree near the road. A survey marker. A flag planted in my life. I couldn't risk going to the old oak to leave my offering. The ritual itself was now a potential piece of evidence against me. The feeling of being watched was no longer a supernatural shiver from the woods. It was the cold, electronic gaze of Officer Cole's grid, and it was closing in on me from all sides. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. In the days following Cole's visit and the first drone flight, an unnerving stillness descended. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a snowfall or the respectful quiet of our pact. This was a coiled, predatory silence. The jays stopped their scolding. The squirrels vanished. The usual rustlings in the undergrowth ceased. Even the deer carcasses I usually found, the grim markers of the creature's domain, were absent. It had gone to ground. It knew. It sensed the new predators, the mechanical eyes in the sky, and the strange new scent of organized human intrusion. It was hiding, observing, and waiting. The pact of mutual avoidance was suspended. Our silent treaty was worthless against this new threat. It had become a free agent, an unpredictable force of terrible power, and I knew its patience was not infinite. The pressure was building, and I feared its release would be catastrophic. My duty, once so clear, was now a tangled mess. For 44 years, I had seen my role as a simple one. Keep the world out, keep the creature in. But Officer Cole, in her crisp uniform and with her unwavering logic, represented the very world I had sworn to protect people from this truth. Lying to her felt like a betrayal of the badge I once wore. Yet telling her the truth was unthinkable. How could I explain that the monster she was hunting was a man who had suffered an unimaginable tragedy? That her well-intentioned search for answers would only lead to more death? She would see a threat to be neutralized. I saw a soul to be protected, or at least left to its lonely grief. My conscience was caught in a vice between my old oath as a ranger and my new, terrible responsibility as the keeper of this creature's secret. Every lie I told her felt like a sin, and the truth felt like a death sentence. A week later, she returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Another DNR truck was parked behind hers, and she didn't bother with pleasantries. Her eyes were harder, her questions more pointed. She had been digging. "Arthur, your service record shows you were the lead ranger for this sector in the winter of 1993. It wasn't a question. That was the year the Anderson family went missing." She said their name, and she watched my face for the slightest flicker of recognition. I kept my expression a mask of weary confusion, the befuddled old man who could barely remember last week, let alone decades ago. But the air in the cabin was thick with accusation. She knew I was lying. She just couldn't prove it yet. She was circling the truth, and she was using the one name I could not bear to hear as her weapon, trying to force me into a mistake. The pressure was becoming immense, a physical weight on my chest. She finally laid her cards on the table. She stood in the middle of my small living room, the snowy owl feather still resting on the windowsill just behind her, an invisible witness. "I don't believe in monsters, Mr. Penn," she said, her voice low and intense. "But I believe in patterns, and I believe you are at the center of this one. You know what's out there. You've been living with it." She took a step closer. "So this is the choice. You can help me. You can tell me what you know, and we can handle this quietly, with my team. Or, I go back to my superiors, and I tell them I have an uncooperative person of interest in a multi-decade string of disappearances, and they will get a federal warrant. They won't send 2 trucks, Arthur. They'll send 20. They will turn this forest into a military base." Her ultimatum hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. The choice was no longer if the world was coming, but how violently it would arrive. As she drove away, leaving me with her impossible choice, I finally understood the true nature of the threat. It wasn't the creature's hunger I had to fear most. It was hers. Cole's hunger for order, for data, for a rational explanation that could be filed away in a report. Her righteous, well-intentioned crusade was the most dangerous force this forest had ever seen. If I told her the truth, she wouldn't see a grieving father. She'd see a biological anomaly, a threat to be contained or exterminated. If I said nothing, she would bring the full, clumsy, brutal weight of the government down on this place. Her drones and soldiers would corner the creature. And when it was cornered, it wouldn't be captured. It would fight. It would tear through her teams with a grief-fueled rage that they could not possibly comprehend. Her search for answers would only lead to a massacre. I saw it with perfect, sickening clarity. I couldn't help her. I couldn't let her proceed. I had to stop her completely. That night, as the storm finally broke, I understood what I had to do. The air grew heavy and cold, the sky a bruised purple-gray. This morning, the blizzard began. Not with a fury, but with a quiet, deliberate intent. The first fat snowflakes drifting down like ash. I knew Cole would be back. Her ultimatum was a promise, and this storm was her deadline. I felt time collapsing. 44 years of quiet vigilance narrowing to these last few hours. My heart was a cold, heavy stone in my chest. There was only one place left to go. I pulled on my worn parka, my hands shaking as I tied my boots. I had to go to the old oak. It wasn't for a ritual. It wasn't to renew a pact. It was to bear witness, to look into the heart of the storm one last time and face the truth I had so carefully guarded. I walked out of my cabin, leaving the door unlocked behind me. The snow was already covering my tracks. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the pines, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like an ending, a final, mournful breath before the world went white and silent. I reached the clearing. The ancient oak stood as it always had, a dark skeleton against the swirling grey. The air here was different, colder, electric. As I stood before the tree, the snow began to churn, a localized vortex of white just beyond the branches. And then, it was there. It wasn't a sudden appearance. It was more like the world resolved. The swirling flakes coalescing into a shape that had been there all along. It was impossibly tall and thin, a thing of emaciated limbs and unnatural angles, the color of wet ash and old bone. It made no move toward me. It simply stood, its form flickering in and out of focus with the gusts of snow. For 44 years, it had been a presence, a set of tracks, a disembodied voice. Now, seeing it, I felt no terror, only a profound, soul-crushing pity. It was a monument to starvation, a statue carved from pain. Then, it slowly raised a long grey arm, a branch of a thing with too many joints, and made a dry, chattering sound, like ice cracking in a fire. The chattering sound stopped, with a slow, deliberate motion. It brought its long skeletal fingers to where its mouth should be, a gesture of hunger, of eating. My own throat went dry. Then, it turned that same horrifying hand and pointed. Not at me, not at my cabin. It pointed through the swirling snow toward the distant town, toward the faint lights where civilization clung to the edge of the wilderness. It held the gesture for a long, silent moment. Then came the sound. A whisper, dry and rustling like dead leaves, but perfectly clear above the wind. Julian, it whispered the podcaster's name. A cold wave of understanding washed over me. This was its intention. It was going to hunt. But then, a second sound followed, one that shattered my heart. It was the faint, ghostly sound of a woman weeping, an audio mirage of pure grief. A voice I knew, the voice of Sarah Anderson's mother, from an old news report I had seen in 1993, begging for any news of her lost children. The father was not just grieving, he was calling for his family, and Croft's greedy hunger had made him the target. I stumbled backwards, my boots sinking into the deepening snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The truth was a physical weight, a crushing blow. The creature, this tormented father, was being drawn out by the podcast's grotesque fame. Julian Croft, with his arrogant quest for a story, had become a beacon for the very tragedy he was exploiting. He had made himself an echo of the hunger that started it all. I knew what would happen. The creature would go after him, and Officer Cole, with her drones and her sensors, would go after the creature. Her team would walk into a buzzsaw of grief-fueled rage. Men would die. And the truth, the horrible human truth of the Anderson family, would be buried under a pile of bodies and sensational headlines. I saw the branching paths of the future, and every single one ended in blood and noise. Every path but one. There was only one way to stop it all. To give them a different story. To give them a monster they could understand. A monster they could catch. I made it back to my porch just as her headlights cut through the snow. The DNR truck crunched to a halt, and Officer Cole emerged, her face grim and determined against the storm. She was here to collect her answer. I didn't let her speak. I stood there, snow collecting on my shoulders, and met her gaze. "You were right," I said, my voice flat, devoid of the folksy charm I had used before. "I am the center of it. You want to know what's out there? I'll tell you. It's me." I let the lie settle in the cold air between us. There's no monster, no spirit of the forest. I made it all up, all of it. The stories, the whispers, they were for the developers, for the tourists, for nosy podcasters. This is my land, my silence, and I created a ghost to protect it. I watched her face, the flicker of confusion warring with the satisfaction of a theory confirmed. I was handing her the simple, rational explanation she craved, packaged in the form of a disturbed, territorial old man. I was making myself the answer to her puzzle, The lie wasn't enough. A cranky old man wasn't a good enough reason to bring in the feds. I had to make myself a true monster. The Anderson family, I said, my voice dropping to a low, cold confession. That was me, too. Cole's professional mask finally cracked. I saw a flash of genuine shock in her eyes. They trespassed, I lied, weaving a fiction from the fragments of truth. Came onto my property, argued with me about a shortcut. I told them a storm was coming. A bad one. They didn't listen. They went off into the woods anyway, angry. I paused, letting the implication hang in the air, heavier than the snow. I knew where they were. I heard them for a while. But a man has a right to his peace. It wasn't my job to save them. I made myself into the cold, selfish heart of the darkness she was investigating. I confessed not to murder, but to a sin far more believable and, in its own way, more monstrous, a complete and total absence of humanity. She didn't hesitate. The words were barely out of my mouth before she was speaking into her radio, her voice tight with adrenaline. Her partner moved in, his face a mask of professional neutrality as he turned me around and clicked the cold steel of the handcuffs around my wrists. It was done. I had traded my freedom for the forest's silence. As they led me toward the truck, Cole took one last look back at my cabin, a final sweep to secure the scene in her mind. Her eyes scanned the room through the window I had left open, and then they stopped. They locked onto the windowsill, onto the single, perfect, white snowy owl feather. I saw it. A tiny flicker in her expression, a momentary glitch in her triumphant logic. The feather didn't fit. It was a piece of poetry in a story of brutal prose. It was the one detail from the real 1993 case file that I hadn't accounted for in my confession. I had given her a monster, but I had also given her a ghost. A question that would follow her for the rest of her career. A seed of the real, terrible truth. And so I am here, in this quiet room, telling you this story. My confession worked. The official narrative is clean and simple. A reclusive, disturbed former ranger, responsible for years of psychological warfare against intruders and criminally negligent in the 1993 disappearance of the Anderson family. The case is closed. The comprehensive DNR survey was cancelled. Officer Cole got her monster, and the forest got its peace. The podcaster Julian Croft got the ending to his seasoner, sensational, human one and left, his hunger sated. The drones are gone. The sensors were never planted. The silence I bought with my name has returned to the Superior National Forest. I traded 44 years of freedom for it. It was the final offering, the last term of a pact I never fully understood until the very end. I gave them my life story, so that the real one could remain hidden in the snow, safe from the world's insatiable appetite. The elders warned me in the winter of 1980. This morning, from a room with a locked door, I finally understood. Never eat what the ice offers you. It was never about cannibalism. It was a warning about the nature of human hunger itself. The desperate hunger for survival that can turn a father into a monster. But there are other hungers. The developer's hunger for land. The tourist's hunger for a thrill. The podcaster's hunger for a story. Officer Cole's hunger for an answer. My own desperate hunger for solitude and atonement. The Wendigo isn't a demon that arrives from the outside. It is the name we give to the terrible transformation that happens when our own insatiable appetites meet the cold, desperate emptiness of the wilderness. I didn't just hide a creature. I contained a human tragedy, absorbing it into my own story to stop it from spreading like a disease. I became the scapegoat for a sin that belongs to all of us. I often wonder if Cole ever pulls the Anderson file. I wonder if she looks at the photo of the smiling 10-year-old girl and reads the note about her prized possession. I wonder if she remembers the impossible feather on my windowsill and feels a shiver of doubt. I gave her an ending, but I left her with a question that has no answer she can accept. I traded my freedom to protect a man's eternal grief, leaving the cursed father to his lonely, unending watch. The winter still has a voice, it always will. But for now, it has a secret keeper, and that is enough. Thank you for listening to my confession. If this story has stayed with you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to understand that not all monsters are what they seem. And please, stick around to see the story we have recommended for you on the screen. There are more truths hiding in the static.